Our scripture lesson today comes from Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. And a woman in the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. Then she continued kissing his feet and anointing them with the ointment. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner." Jesus spoke up and said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." "Teacher," he replied, "speak." A certain creditor had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both of them. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, "I suppose the one for whom he canceled the greater debt." And Jesus said to him, "You have judged rightly." Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little." Then he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." But those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." The word of the Lord. So it's kind of hard to believe that Easter is in 2 weeks, right? We're 2 weeks out from that. I felt like Jesus was just born, and now he's going to die and, be resurrected. It comes fast this year. And what that means is, of course, is that we're coming to the end of our sermon series, Modern Parables, which I'm sure for some of you will be a huge, great relief that you no longer have to hear me tell these stories anymore, and we'll go back to the more traditional sermons that you're used to. But for the next couple of weeks, I have your attention on the modern parables, and they're going to go all the way through Easter Sunday. So modern parables, for those of you who might not be aware, I just need to tell you what they are all about. A modern parable is where we take a story like what we just read from the Gospel of Luke, and we transpose that into a modern setting. So each week, I tell you a story, and this story is fictional. Although it's based in real people and real places, you cannot go and research this story fact for fact, like many of my other sermons. Furthermore, I will give you no explanation as to what I want you to take away from this sermon. You simply listen to it and compare it to the narrative that we read, and hopefully my story will help illuminate some of the things that I want you to take away from this particular narrative that we read about in Luke's Gospel. So today's story, it begins on September 7th, 2010, in the neighborhood of Dorchester, which is found inside the city limits of Baltimore, Maryland. Dorchester is known for two things: poverty and Garrison Middle School. And on this particular day, Garrison had come back into session for their full school year term. And kids, they're running through the hallways, they're trying to find their classrooms, and the teachers, they're standing in the doors to the classrooms, and they're watching the kids go by, they're inviting them into the classes, and they're monitoring their behavior. Now, Garrison Middle School, it is comprised of a mere 163 students. But in this particular year, they have been given a label by the federal government of being persistently dangerous. Now, in order to be given the label of persistently dangerous by the federal government, it means that you have to have a large number of suspensions among your student body for offenses such as arson, drugs, weapons, and assault. Mind you, this is a middle school comprised of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. The average age of the kids in this school range between 11 and 14 years old, and they are being suspended for setting fires, buying and selling drugs, carrying knives and guns, and using those weapons to assault other students. In other words, Garrison Middle School was kind of like a war zone. Now, the average amount of time that a teacher would spend at Garrison before leaving was about 1 to 2 years. They did have some long-term teachers, but most of the teachers who came through there worked with Teach for America. I don't know if you all are familiar with that organization, but Teach for America takes newly graduated college students and sends them out to under-resourced schools, usually found in urban or rural areas. So as a college student, you apply, and then they send you to this place that probably doesn't have a lot of money in their budget in order to do everything that they need to do. And so they're bringing you in because you have a lot of spunk and verve. You're just out of school, right? And you're ready to go for it. Well, Garrison had a tough reputation. They were always looking for people who would be able to be diverse, because diversity in your background was essential to being able to teach at Garrison. Garrison had this reputation for chewing up and spitting out these young, idealistic, white, 22-year-old suburban kids who wanted to change the world. Most of them came away from Garrison feeling as though the Baltimore City schools were so broken they were beyond repair. This is why Teach for America became very excited when there was an applicant in their pool who was very different from the applicants that they had received in prior years. This applicant was a man named Roland Weiss. He was 45 years old, and he had just graduated from Louisiana State University. Now, Roland, he had been a police officer in New Orleans for the last 20 years, and after Hurricane Katrina, he left, he went back to school, and he got his degree in teaching. And they figured that because he had worked in some of the toughest wards in New Orleans, that this guy would be a really good match for Garrison Middle School. So there he is, Roland. He's standing in the door to his classroom, and he's greeting these newly minted sixth graders as they're coming into his class. And the first thing that he notices about them is how old they look. They're only 11 or 12 years old, but they look like they've lived a lifetime. And one thing that the principal told him upon arriving is that 95% of the students at Garrison qualify for free lunch. That means that 95% of those students, their parents are making $20,000 or less per year. 46% of the students at Garrison would never graduate from high school. So he's watching these kids come in, and then the bell rings, and he goes into the classroom, and when he walks inside, all of a sudden there's this big uproar in the class. And he can barely see because the kids are all running around, but two kids have grabbed the arms of the student and they've pinned him down to a desk, and a third kid is behind him, punching him as hard as he can in the back. And Roland, he yells out, "Hey, stop that!" But the class is in such chaos that they don't even notice that he's there. He might as well not even be present. And he's about to run over and grab the kids to stop them when the commanding voice of a woman comes over the room, and they all hear, "Devon, get off of him." Turns around, Roland does, and looks and sees that there's the principal of the school standing in his door. And immediately upon hearing her voice, all the kids scatter, and they go and they sit in their seats. The principal walks in, goes over to the boy who was getting beat up, and he's this little guy. He's very small for his age. He's got tears streaming down his face. She says, "Go to the nurse." Then she grabs Devon by the shirt, picks him up, and carries him out of the room, and she looks at the class and she says, "All of you better give Mr. Weiss your undivided attention. I don't want any of you getting up out of your seat for the rest of the day." She pulled him out, and as she walked across Roland, she says, "You got this?" He said, "Absolutely," although in his mind, he wasn't so sure whether he really had it. So he says, goes back to the middle of the classroom, he says, "As you can see on the board, my name is Mr. Weiss. I'd like you all to check out a sheet of paper and a pencil, and we are going to play a game together." And immediately, 6 hands shoot up in the air. He calls on one girl, and she says, "I don't have any paper." And he looks at her kind of quizzically, and he's like, "It's the first day of school. How do you not have any paper?" And she just looks at him and says, matter of fact, "Well, my mom never got me any." And so he goes to his desk, he picks up a loose leaf sheet of paper, he puts it down, and he says, "Tell your mom to go out and get you some for tomorrow." Calls on another one that's got his hand up. He says, "I don't have any paper either." He says, "Do none of you have any paper who have your hands up?" And they all shake their heads and they say, "Nope." So he says, "All right." So he goes to his desk, he grabs some sheets, he puts them down. He says, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. I want you to write down 3 things that nobody else knows about you." Immediately, hands shoot back up in the air. He calls on one, and he says, I don't have a pencil. And so he looks at all the rest of the kids, and he goes, do none of the rest of you, let me guess, have any pencils? And they say, yep. And he's starting to get agitated at this point. And he's like, well, I don't have enough pencils for everybody in here. He's like, so what are we going to do about this? And they all just kind of stare at him blankly. And he says, okay, just forget about the paper and the pencils. I want you to imagine in your mind 3 things that nobody knows about you. This kid calls out from the side of the class, what if you can only think of 2? And he says, 2 will be fine. And then this other kid shouts out, this is stupid. Everybody already knows everything about me anyway. And then he just loses it. He can't handle it anymore. And he goes, all right, you know what? We're done. If you guys are going to complain about a game, we're just going to go straight to the books. So he picks up this big stack of books, and he starts putting them down on the desks in the rows, and he's kind of smacking them down hard because he's kind of irritated. And so he gets to the last row, and he's 4 books short. And so he goes over, and he clicks on the intercom system, and the secretary comes on, and he says, who do I talk to about getting more books? And the secretary says, the books you have in your classroom are the books that you have for your students. And he says, well, why didn't you all just order more? I mean, clearly you knew that we were short. And she says, I understand your frustration, Mr. Weiss, but there's no more money in the budget for new books. And this is where he was silenced, because he knew that they didn't have a lot of money, but he didn't realize that they didn't have enough money to even buy textbooks. And he knew it was going to be hard to teach in this environment, but with no paper, no pencils, and no books, it was going to be nearly impossible. He somehow made it through his first day. He goes home, and he's sitting at his kitchen table, and he just feels numb all over. This is the feeling he had when he was a police officer back in New Orleans. When he was a police officer there, he'd often go into the wards, and he'd be arresting the same people over and over again. And when he did this, he felt as though he wasn't reducing crime at all. He was just simply managing it. And so he felt the same way about these kids, because he knew in the long run that without the resources, that basically he was just going to be managing these kids. He wasn't going to be teaching them anything. And so as he was sitting there contemplating the fact that he was just a glorified babysitter, he came to a decision. He said, you know what? I made a commitment that I'm going to teach these kids, and I'm going to follow through on that no matter what. So he gets up, he takes the books that he has for the year, he goes to a Kinko's, and he starts making copies. And then when he's done making the copies, he goes to this store, this office supply store, and he buys a bulk case of 200 pencils that he's going to have for the rest of the year. And he figures, you know what, if the school can't afford to pay for the materials, he's going to do it himself. So after 8 hours and $600, he has put together in all of these binders all of the lessons for the first month for these students, and he has them all together. They're very nice, and he goes in early the next day, and he places them all on the desks, gets them all nice and neat, and then he places a sharpened pencil next to every desk. He's even taken the time to print out their names at the front of their binders, and so he stands there at the classroom door, and he's waiting for the kids to come in, and he's so proud of himself because he thinks now these kids are going to have something of their own, and they're going to love it. And so he waits, and then the bell rings, and he goes in, and he sees that all the kids are in the back corner. And he looks on the ground, and there's little chunks of pencil wood and lead all over the floor. And as he goes to the back, he can see that the kids have been pencil fighting with each other. I don't know if you all know what pencil fighting is, but it's where you hold a pencil like this, and basically the other kid tries to break it. And so basically they're snapping these pencils in half, and the clear winner was Devon, no doubt about it. He had just snapped everybody's pencil right across. The only one that was left was his. And of course, he'd been up all night. He hadn't slept. And so he was just absolutely livid. And he says, everybody sit down. And everybody just runs to their seats. And he says, Devon, we will all sit here and watch while you pick up all of those pieces of pencil on the floor. And Devon looks straight at him and says, nope. And so he goes, all right, then go down to the principal's office. And so Devon gets up and he leaves. And that's how it was most days. He'd come in, and it was always a match. It was Roland versus Devon who was going to win. And it almost felt like to Roland that Devon spent his days thinking of ways that he could make Roland's life difficult. One day he came in and he tore out all of the pages in the binders in everyone's book and just threw them all over the room. Another day he came in and he actually threw a smoke bomb into the room. They had to evacuate the school when they did this. He got a month suspension for doing that. He even got super creative. One day he was able to somehow manage to hook up a tripwire across the class. And so when Roland came in, he tripped over it, he fell, and he smacked his nose, and he was bleeding. And it was all he could do to not come to blows with this 12-year-old kid who he was up against every single day. Eventually, he went to the principal, and he asked for Devon to be removed from his classroom because it was becoming so troublesome that he wasn't able to do anything with the class. And the principal said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that because there's only one other sixth grade class, and in that other sixth grade class is a boy who's exactly like Devon, and I can't imagine one teacher having to deal with two kids like that. It would just be impossible. So I'm sorry, the alpha male match is just going to have to continue for a while." So he makes it through, they get through to December, and they're finally at the last day of school before break. Now, I know for the teachers in here that when you're in a good school district, you're looking forward to that Christmas break after going through that first part of it. You can imagine how he was feeling. He was sitting there and he was daydreaming about being able to leave the chaos of his classroom for 2 weeks. He was going to leave the cold of Baltimore. He was going to go down to New Orleans and see his family. He was so excited to get out of there. And then while he's sitting there and he's thinking about this, there's a knock on the door to his room. And he looks over and he sees the gym teacher, and his kids were currently at gym class for this period. And they open the door, and there's Devon standing next to him. He's got a black eye, and the gym teacher says, "He got into a fight with an 8th grader. I need to go deal with the 8th grader first. Can you hold on to this kid for a few minutes, and then I'll come back, we'll get him, and we'll take care of him." And so he says, "Okay, fine." So they bring him in, they sit Devon down, Roland sits there, and the gym teacher leaves. Now, it's silent for a few minutes, and then Roland, he just kind of looks at Devon, and they've never actually had a real conversation before up to this point. It's always just been the back and forth of management. And so he just asks him, he says, "Why do you act this way? Like, why are you always fighting everybody?" And Devon, he just sits there, shrugs his shoulders and says, "I don't know." And he's going to leave it behind, but he decides in that moment that he wants to go further with it. He goes, no, really. Why do you act this way? Because obviously you don't have to act this way, but every day you come in and you choose to be like this. Aren't you just tired of doing this? Isn't your mom tired of always having to come in here and pick you up and that you're always being suspended? And Devon, he just didn't say anything. He just looked straight at him, quiet. And so he decides he's going to change his line of questioning. And he goes, "What's it like living at your house?" And Devon laughs. And he goes, "House? What house? I don't live in no house." And he realized that he'd used the wrong word, clearly. He goes, no, what I mean is, he goes, "Where do you live?" And Devon says, "Nowhere." He goes, "No, you have to live somewhere. Like, where do you go after school?" And he goes, "I stand in line at the shelter." And Roland says, "You mean like the homeless shelter?" And he nods and he says, "Yeah." He goes, "So what you're telling me is that you and your mom, you live at the homeless shelter together." And he corrects him and he says, "No, I live at the homeless shelter. I don't know where my mom is." And Roland thinks about this and he realizes that, yeah, actually, he had never actually seen Devon's mother throughout any of the disciplinary things that he had gone through with him. And so he says, "So you must live with your father then?" And he goes, "I'm supposed to be living with my father, but I don't know where he is, and he doesn't want me anyway." And so Roland, he says, "So let me get this straight. You are totally and completely by yourself. There's no one there caring for you. How do you eat? How do you buy clothes for yourself?" And Devon smiled a little bit. He goes, "There's food and there's clothing at the shelter, but if I don't like what they got, then I'll just go out and steal it direct from the store. If I can't steal it direct, I'll just run drugs for the Bloods for quick cash, and then I can buy whatever I want." Now, Roland knew a lot about the Bloods and the Crips, these gangs, because they were down in New Orleans when he was down there. And they were always warring with each other. And he knew that a kid as young as Devon who was getting involved in that usually they'd be either dead or in jail by the time they were 20. And so Roland, his first reaction was to say, it's a mistake. That's a mistake. You really shouldn't be doing anything with the Bloods. Because aren't you afraid that you're going to get in trouble with the police? You're going to get caught and you're going to get arrested one day. And this actually made Devon absolutely livid. He's like, mistake? What you talking about, mistake? That's the only protection that I have. If it wasn't for them, I'd be dead already. Although you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Because you're white. And white people don't have to worry about getting shot. So don't judge me for doing what I do in order to survive. Not that you care anyway. And then he folds his arms, and he sits there, and he just looks at the ground. And Roland, as he was listening to this, the one thing that really took him back was that last little piece. Not that you care anyway. That really got to him. And so he stood up, he goes over to his door, he shuts the door, and he comes back, and he sits on the front of his desk, and he says, I do care. I care a lot more than you realize. Just because I'm white doesn't mean that my life's been perfect. I've made mistakes that I really, really regret. I told you that I lived in New Orleans. I never told you what I did. I was a police officer down there. And I worked in neighborhoods not unlike the one that you live in right now. I was part of the first wave of officers after the Hurricane Katrina came through, after all had been evacuated. I was the first wave that went back in after they drained the city out because a lot of looting was going on at that time, and my unit was supposed to go back in and make sure that anybody who was breaking the law was caught and arrested. And so when I was on one of these patrols, I came to a store. It was an abandoned electronics store, and I heard that there was some commotion, and I could hear that they were coming down. And so I waited outside, I drew my gun, and this guy, he came out, and he was holding a television. And he was a kid, not much older than you. And he comes running out, and I tell him to freeze, to not move. And so he drops this, and he reaches into his pocket and pulls out what I think is a gun. And so I shoot him right there. And he falls to the ground, and I notice that when he's on the ground that he didn't have a gun at all, that it was actually his wallet. And so his sister, who was upstairs, she comes running down, and she has a TV in her hand too, and she sees him on the ground, and she drops the television, and she falls on top of him, and she starts screaming. And she says, why'd you shoot him? Why'd you shoot him? We weren't going to keep him. We were going to sell him. We just needed some money for food. Why'd you shoot him? Over and over, she kept saying this, and I'm sitting here watching this kid bleeding to death. And I didn't know what to do. And he died before we could get him to the hospital. When I went back, they had an investigation, and I was found not guilty of any kind of misconduct. But I couldn't live with myself and being a cop any longer, and so I left. I went back to school. I became a teacher. And my goal was to make up for the mistake that I had made with these kids. My goal was to somehow help a kid who had to steal in order to feed themselves. And so, seeing you here and realizing what you're going through, you're exactly the kind of person who I've always wanted to help. Let me give you the life that I took from that young man. But the fact is, I know you probably don't want it. I know that it's hard for you to accept help, but I want you to know that I'm here and I'm willing to help you if you're willing to take it. And at that point, after he'd said it, there was a knock on his door, and the principal was standing outside, and she looked inside. She goes, Devon, come with me. And she looks over at Roland and says, Mr. Weiss, I hope you have a good break. Are you going back down to New Orleans to see your family? And he looks over at her and he says, no, actually, I think I'm going to stay here. I'm going to volunteer over at the homeless shelter. And as Devon was walking across the room, he gets to the other side, he turns and he looks at Roland and he says, Have a good break, Mr. Weiss. I'll see you on Christmas Day. Amen.